All right, so tonight we're going to continue looking at how God works. And tonight we're going to focus on, has God worked the same way throughout history? So has he always done the same things in the same ways? When we look at this, we're going to remember, as we talked about last time, that God does not change. So he himself, his nature and character does not change. His power does not change, and his plan does not change. That's what we looked at last time. But what about the way that he works? Sometimes God uses different methods to accomplish his purpose. And so there are some things that God has done and even will do in the future that he does only once. There are some things he does infrequently, so he does them more than once, but not very often. And sometimes he does certain things frequently, but only during certain times. So we're going to look at those ideas. And of course, there are some things that God is consistently doing all the time, but we're just looking at these three ideas tonight. All right, so the first thing we want to look at is that there are some things God does only once. So if we think about what those could be, here's one idea. You can see what this may bring to mind, right? There was a creation in the beginning, wasn't there? He made light. He separated the waters from the waters. He made dry land and plants. He made the sun, and then he made the birds and the fish and the animals and man. And we can summarize that in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that is something that he has only done once. Yeah, it took him 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh day. He was finished. He rested. And so he does not continue creating things. Now, that doesn't mean that his power is not involved in the continuation of the creation that he made, but the actual creating things, bringing new things into existence by his word, he does not continue doing that. Another thing that happened only once is the flood. All right, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 8 through 10, it says, "Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." So God tells us he only did that one time, and he's never going to do it again. Now, Peter does tell us that there's going to be fire that will destroy all things in the end, but that again is only going to happen once. And so we can see that there are certain things God has done that he does not continue doing all the time. He just did them one time. There are also some things that God does infrequently, or not very often. In Nehemiah 9, verse 13, Nehemiah reminds, in speaking to God, he brings up what God has done in the past, and he says, "You came down also on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven and gave them just ordinances and true laws, good statutes and commandments." And I think there are two things here that are fairly infrequent that God has done, that he has done more than once, which is to speak from heaven, to speak directly to people, and to give them just ordinances and true laws, or to give law to people. When we talk about the giving of law, certainly God spoke to Adam and Eve and gave them laws. He spoke to Noah and gave him laws. He spoke to Abraham and gave him laws. And he says that Abraham kept his laws. He gave laws through Moses. He gave laws through Jesus. But in general, there's not really, it's not like every person he's directly talking to and giving some new law. This is not something that was frequent. This is not something that just happens, every year or every 10 years or even every 100 years. This is something that God gave when he had a reason to give a law, when there was some kind of change coming in, but he has not done this just consistently over and over again throughout history. When you talk about speaking directly to people, now, of course, there were the prophets that God spoke directly to, but if we think about speaking to non-prophets, not organizations, but people that are not prophets, then when we think about, like when he spoke on Mount Sinai, as we read, he spoke to Adam and Eve. Maybe we can consider them to be prophets, but certainly he did speak to them. Cain, he spoke directly to. Hagar, the slave of Sarah, who ran away because she was being treated harshly by Sarah. God spoke directly to her, told her to go home and submit herself. Abimelech was warned by God in a dream, spoke directly to him in that about Sarah. And he spoke to the people at Mount Sinai. He spoke from heaven at Jesus' baptism. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And then there's after raising Lazarus, when Jesus says, glorify your name, God spoke from heaven and said, I have glorified it. I will glorify it again. And some people said that it was just thunder, but they heard this voice from heaven. But this is not something that was common. It was not frequent. I'm sure there are some other times that you can think of that I left off. In Numbers chapter 12, he talks about the difference between how God spoke with Moses and how he spoke with other prophets, and showing that it's not really the same as his usual. In Numbers 12, verse 6 through 8, when God is talking to Aaron and Miriam, he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So God makes it clear that this is not how he normally speaks with people. This is different. So these are things that he does not do frequently. But there have been times when he has spoken directly to people like this. Another thing we might think of is, God killing people, striking them dead because of their sin. He killed people in the flood that he brought. He killed Judah's sons for being wicked. He killed Nadab and Abihu for offering strange fire. He killed those who looked in the Ark of the Covenant when it was returned from the Philistines. He killed Uzzah for touching the Ark. He killed Ananias and Sapphira for lying to God. He killed King Herod for accepting praise for being God. And there are, I'm sure, some other cases, but this is not a normal thing. This is not the usual. If this was God's usual way of doing things, then we would all be dead. But God has done certain things for special reasons throughout history. And he certainly has proven he has the power to do this. But it also shows us that there must be a special reason, something we are to learn from this when he does something that he does not normally do. It teaches us a lesson about God and about his purpose, and it brings about further understanding or furthers his purpose that he has, his plan for salvation through Christ. And then there are some things that God does often or frequently, but only during certain times. And one of those is speaking directly to people. And we find that before the giving of the law of Moses, he spoke to people much more frequently. He did speak directly to some people even after the law of Moses was given, but especially prophets. But it was not as often as he did before. He didn't need to speak directly to people as much after the law was given because they would already know what he said through the law. It was only when he needed to further his plan to bring about Christ, to have the nation to be there, that Christ would come through, whatever. But it, related to his bringing about his plan, if he had a reason to do it, he would speak directly to people. But you find that when there wasn't such a need for it, he did not do it as often. And we know about the 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's a long time, 400 years, where God was not speaking to people at all, as far as we know. Certainly nothing was written down from God during that time. There's no record of prophecy during that time. And that was until John the Baptist, and then you had John and Jesus, and then after that, after the church is established, we find many prophets in these early days of the church. But during that 400 years, that was not the case. There were not many prophets, if any. So we don't know about during those 400 years if there were any prophets, but it certainly was not a regular or frequent thing. All right, and so remember, God is the same today as he has always been, but he has not always worked the same way in the past. He uses whatever method he wants to use to further his purpose. Some things he does once, some things he does not very often, just infrequently, and some things he does frequently, but only at certain times. And then, of course, there are things that he does consistently, regularly, all the time, but we'll take a look at some of those things in another class. But that's the lesson for tonight. I hope that has helped us in our thinking about how God works. Thank you.